Welcome back. In our last lecture, we examined the early history of the Byzantine Empire and the reign of the Emperor Justinian. And we saw how Justinian's attempts to reconquer parts of what had formerly been part of the Roman Empire in the West overtaxed the Byzantine Empire, resulting in the inability of the Byzantines to maintain control of some of what they conquered in the West, and after Justinian's death, resulting in the near collapse of the Byzantine Empire itself, as Slavs and Persians attacked the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, in the 620s, forcing the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius to take a desperate gamble and attack the Persian Empire in the hope of relieving pressure on Constantinople. It was a successful gamble. By 630, the Byzantines had recaptured what they had lost to the Persians. Heraclius and the head of the Persian Empire had no way of knowing in 630 that within 2 decades they would both be overrun from an unexpected direction by an unanticipated foe. Within 2 decades of the cessation of the war between the Persians and the Byzantines, the Persian Empire would be destroyed by the Arabs, and the Byzantine Empire itself would be substantially overrun by the Arabs. And indeed, the Arabs would create, within the space of a century, an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Himalaya Mountains in India. Today we're going to examine the emergence of Islam in Arabia in the early 7th century, and we're going to examine the process by which Arabs exploded out of Arabia following the death of Muhammad in 632, in part because of the intrinsic interest of the emergence of Islam, but also in part because the emergence of Islam was going to have important consequences for parts of Europe not conquered by the Arabs following Muhammad's death. Now, during Muhammad's lifetime, Arabia was a relatively tough place to live because of its physical environment. Much of it was desert and dry grassland, capable of supporting only a relatively sparse population of nomads who moved from place to place and raised cattle for a living. The population of Arabia consists mostly of these Bedouin, these desert-dwelling nomads, who, when they weren't raising cattle, were raiding cattle. They would attack the cattle of neighboring tribes, and there are hundreds of relatively small tribes within Arabia taking their cattle in raids known as the razzia, which is almost the national pastime of Arabia in the 7th century. There were some areas capable of supporting more sedentary existence based on agriculture. Areas around oases might know villages and towns, and the south of Arabia was relatively well watered. You could also find some towns in the desert that served primarily as trading posts, as commercial centers for the caravans that would cross the deserts of Arabia. And most notable of these towns was Mecca. There was, in Arabia, in the 6th century, the early 7th century, some Christianity and some Judaism practiced, but most of the inhabitants of Arabia are pagan polytheists. One of the gods whom they worship is known as Allah, but he is regarded as, at most, more powerful than other gods, hardly the only god in existence. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born at some point between 570 and 580 AD. And he hailed from Mecca. He's not one of the Bedouin, he's a townsperson. And he appears to have been orphaned at a young age, but to have been fairly successful professionally. He is a merchant, and his financial situation is assured through his marriage to a relatively wealthy widow. It is an odd fact that many of the world's great religions, Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, are founded by men between the ages of 30 and 40. And I often think about this. It's nice to know that I have career options available to me still. As he was in his late 30s and getting near 40, Muhammad began to walk outside Mecca, wandering in the desert hills. And on these solitary walks, he began to have visions, which troubled him deeply. He was not certain of the origin of these visions. He consulted his wife about them, and they pondered where they were coming from. He decided that these were religious revelations that he was receiving, and that it was his obligation to share these revelations with the inhabitants of Mecca. Some residents of Mecca, largely those who are not as well off as the richest members of society welcomed these revelations and gave them a warm reception. The richer families tended not to appreciate Muhammad stirring things up, and as a result, Muhammad had to leave Mecca. He travels to Medina, which is about 280 miles north of Mecca, and indeed he had been invited to go to Medina by some of the town's leaders, hoping that Muhammad could go to Medina and arbitrate feuds among members of different tribes. The flight of Muhammad to Medina in 622 AD is known as the Hijra, and the Islamic calendar counts this as year 1. Once in Medina, Muhammad was successful in arbitrating feuds among the different tribes. His members lived at Medina, and he begins to succeed in uniting various tribes within Arabia behind the new religion that he is presenting to them. Having acquired Medina as a territorial base, having become the ruler of Medina, Muhammad fought against Mecca. He raided the caravans of Mecca, and in 630 AD, he even succeeded in capturing Mecca itself. He died only 2 years later in 632, but he left behind an Arabia consisting of tribes that were now united as members of a single community of believers. The Arab term for this would be the Ummah. As for what the Ummah now believed in, well, they believed in Islam. Islam is a word that means submission, in this case submission to God, and a Muslim, one who believes in Islam, is one who submits. Islam was first and foremost a monotheist religion taught to the previously polytheistic Arabs. Allah is the one God. There is no other God but Allah. And as Muhammad taught Islam, it was in some respects quite similar to Christianity and Judaism, and it seems likely that Muhammad had some personal contact with Christians and Jews, although we're not entirely certain about the nature of those contacts. Certainly, Islam shared and shares with Christianity beliefs such as belief in the last judgment of all people, belief in the resurrection of the body. But in most respects, Islam was more similar to Judaism than to Christianity. Muslims were to practice circumcision, as Jews were and Christians were not. Muslims are abstain ritually from certain foods such as pork, which Christians are not required to do. And the structure of Islam was going to resemble the structure of Judaism far more than Christianity. Christianity has priests, individuals who act as intermediaries between believers and God and are able to administer sacraments. There are no priests in Islam, just as there are no priests in Judaism. Instead, you have scholars, you have rabbis who would comment on religious law, but don't exactly stand between you and your God. These similarities are not all that surprising because Muhammad did not exactly present Islam as a new religion. Rather, he taught it as the ultimate fulfillment and conclusion of the Jewish-Christian tradition. According to Muhammad, Jews and Christians had been the recipients of divine revelations. These were imperfect revelations. These were partial revelations, unlike the present revelation, which is the final revelation of God's will for humanity. But nonetheless, Muhammad taught that the first Muslim had been Abraham, and that Jesus of Nazareth was a figure to be revered by Muslims. Muslims accept the divine inspiration of the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. But there are important differences, of course, between Islam and its fellow monotheistic religions. Muhammad never claimed to be a divine figure himself and always maintained that he was a human being. Muhammad rejected the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth and maintained that he too was a human prophet rather than a divine figure. Within months of the death of Muhammad in 632, the Arabs began to pour out of Arabia and into surrounding territories, especially the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. And the spread of the Arabs and of Islam in the century following Muhammad's death is nothing less than astounding. Already in the 630s, the Arabs had captured Damascus and Jerusalem, which was captured in 638. They capture Egypt by 646. The Persian Empire, which had been fighting toe-to-toe with the Roman Empire for centuries and centuries, doesn't last 2 decades against the Arabs. It collapses by 651 and is taken over by the Arabs. North Africa is captured from the Byzantines by the Arabs during the 690s, and it took less than a century for the Arabs to reach all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. They did not succeed, however, in capturing Constantinople. Like so many groups before and then afterward, Constantinople was simply too tough a nut for them to crack. The Arabs certainly tried besieging Constantinople in 674 and launching a massive attack against Constantinople in 717 and 718, but once again, thanks to its magnificent defensive position, Constantinople was able to hold out against these attacks. How to explain the success of the Arabs and the quick conquest of the Persian Empire and the seizure of so much Byzantine territory? Again, we must rely on earthly factors when trying to evaluate the spread of any religion. And historians can point to a number of factors that benefited Islam and the Arabs in this expansion. Timing was certainly an important factor, and luck was an important factor, because the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire were exhausted after their wars with one another in the 6th and early 7th centuries. The Byzantine Empire, which is still suffering from bubonic plague, was not really in a shape for another major war. Neither was the Persian Empire, yet that is what they both faced as a result of the eruption of the Arabs. Had the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire had to face the Arabs 100 years earlier or 100 years later, things might have turned out rather differently. Another reason for the success of the Arabs against so many of their foes was that they had the element of surprise on their side. No one expected this of the Arabs, because if you asked a Byzantine what they associated with the Arabs, they would have thought, well, the Arabs, they are so divided into hundreds of different tribes, and they spend so much time fighting among themselves, there's no way that they could possibly challenge an empire of our size. They did not realize that the Arabs were achieving such a swift unification. The Arabs enjoyed an element of surprise, not just because no one thought they were capable of doing this, but also because they were able to function in an environments that were quite hostile physically to the Byzantines and even to the Persians. The Arabs were at home in deserts, and they could attack from deserts where the Byzantines and the Persians failed to erect any fortifications, because who's going to attack us out of the desert? When, as happened infrequently, battles against the Byzantines or the Persians went badly, the Arabs would simply fade back into the desert and try and draw the Byzantines or the Persians into this environment where the Arabs were so at home, where they knew they could defeat them. The ability of Arabs to attack for places you do not think any human being could attack from is one of the keys to their swift success, and their expansion tends to stop when they encounter physical environments that are radically different from what they known in Arabia, such as, say, northern France, where camels were not of much use anymore. Perhaps the most important factor, though, in explaining the spread of the Arabs and their military success, though, is religious zeal and the sheer energy that Islam had brought to them and the confidence that Islam had brought to them. The Byzantines and the Persians really scorned and looked down upon the Arabs because they were so fragmented into many different tribes, and the Arabs before Muhammad had to a certain extent internalized this and believed themselves incapable of going toe-to-toe with the Byzantines or the Persians or anyone else for that matter. During the course of the conquest of the Persian Empire, an Arab ambassador made the remarkable statement to the Shah of Persia that, I quote, "Once the Arabs were a wretched race whom you could tread underfoot with impunity. We were reduced to eating dogs and lizards. But for our glory, God has raised up a prophet among us." And this quotation, I think, nicely encapsulates what Islam brought to the Arabs. The Arabs were now God's chosen people. They are destined for great things, even if they do not know exactly what it is that they are supposed to accomplish. They have confidence in themselves now, confidence that they had lacked before. The pacification of the wars that various Arab tribes had fought against one another by Muhammad is also probably an important factor in explaining why the Arabs expand beyond Arabia at all. The tribal raid, the fighting among different tribes, was deeply ingrained part of Arab culture. And when Muhammad forbade this and forbade Muslims from attacking other Muslims and Arabs from attacking other Arabs, well, it created a great deal of pent-up energy because this is what you did most of the time. And this energy needed some sort of a release that came in the very fraught months following the death of Muhammad, when Arabs were uncertain about what it is that they should be doing next. As the Arabs were conquering much of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire and North Africa, religious scholars began to develop a theory to explain and to justify these conquests, a theory that we today would call the theory of jihad. Today, the word jihad means holy war, a war in which those who die are martyrs and receive eternal salvation as their reward. In Muhammad's time, the word jihad did not mean exclusively holy war or even fighting of any sort. The term meant striving or expenditure of effort, and it could refer to all sorts of striving. It could refer to military efforts fought against a foe, but it could also refer to striving against temptation, for example. Certain of Muhammad's pronouncements in the Quran do prefigure the doctrine of jihad that would be worked out by scholars after Muhammad's death, and they build the theory of jihad upon these pronouncements. Some of these pronouncements include: fight the unbelievers totally, even as they fight you totally, and know that God is with the God-fearing. Or, when you meet the unbelievers, let there be smiting of necks with a sword. Then, when you have made great slaughter among them, bind them fast. That seems straightforward enough, but it should be noted that such pronouncements are relatively rare in the rather large and elusive Quran. And the word jihad appears in the Quran about 4 times, and that's it. And it doesn't even always refer to military effort then. It does not, in other words, play a prominent role in the Quran. The idea of jihad is worked out after Muhammad's death, and it is worked out in a specific historical context. It is worked out at a time when it looks as though the Arabs are going to conquer the whole of the known world, and it seems that, given the speed and the rapidity of these conquests, that this was quite possible. According to the theory of jihad developed by these scholars in the 7th and the 8th centuries, there should be only one state in the world, an Islamic state, in which Islamic rule was observed. And the reason for this is that the world should mirror as closely as possible the perfect unity of the one Allah. Since there's only one God, there should be one state in the world. However, the world as it existed when the scholars are devising this theory does not have a single Islamic state. Instead, it is divided into 2 parts. One, those territories where Islamic rulers are in control and where Islamic law is observed, and scholars refer to this as the House of Islam or the Dar al-Islam. The other area refers to the parts of the world where non-Muslims are ruling, following various types of law, and this part of the world is known as the Dar al-Arb, or the House of War. According to the theory of jihad, developed in the 7th and 8th centuries, the House of Islam had to absorb the House of War and take it over so that there would be a single Islamic state and Islamic law would be observed throughout the world. And the purpose of jihad is to accomplish this. Jihad is the religious duty falling upon every Muslim. Muslim rulers under this doctrine of jihad are forbidden to have peaceful relations with their neighbors extending for more than 10 years. At most, you can sign a truce of 10 years. But ultimately, your goal must be to conquer these territories. And those who die fighting on behalf of this ideal are to be considered martyrs. It should be noted that the goal of the jihad is the political unity of the world in a single Islamic state. And again, I'm speaking of jihad in the 8th century, not as the term is necessarily used today. It does not refer to the religious unity of the world, and in that sense, jihad is a political rather than a religious concept. Although victory over unbelievers in the jihad is regarded as proof of the correctness of Muhammad's teachings, nonetheless, only pagans are forbidden to exist within the house of Islam. They are to be faced with a choice of conversion or death. They cannot be tolerated. Jews and Christians are to have a certain status within the house of Islam because they are peoples of the book. They were the recipients of divine revelation, of the Old Testament and of the New Testament, and therefore they need to be accorded a certain respect, and they need to be allowed to practice their religion. They are not to be forced to convert to Islam. They are to practice their religions under certain restrictions. They are not to proselytize among Muslims, certainly. But nonetheless, they are to be allowed to exist, and in this sense, the world can remain multi-religious for an indefinite period of time. An important restriction is to be placed upon peoples of the book, upon Jews and Christians who live in Muslim countries in this theory of jihad. They have to pay a special tax, a tax called the jizya, which is a sign of their acceptance of Muslim rule. The jizya is collected from Jews and Christians in lands that are conquered by the Arabs, but the jizya actually worked against the conversion of Jews and Christians to Islam, and indeed it was not unknown for Islamic rulers to forbid Jews and Christians from converting, because once they did so, it cut into your tax revenue very badly, so you would not allow them to become Muslim in order to keep the revenues from the jizya high. Once again, tax breaks doing the important work in the ancient world. Although the jihad was very important in the first century of Islam's existence, it burned itself out by the early 8th century. As the boundaries of the House of Islam extended so far in so many different directions, it was impossible to maintain the sort of dynamism that had existed shortly after Muhammad's death. And by the early 8th century, Muslim rulers were establishing regular diplomatic contacts with their non-Muslim neighbors, and they would remain at peace with those neighbors for periods of more than 10 years, and they would abandon any pretense that they were going to ever try to incorporate the house of war into the house of Islam. The theory of jihad became a dead letter after the early 8th century, but it's still on the books, and it can be called upon in the future, revived whenever the Islamic world feels itself to be threatened. One such period would be the Crusades, when the theory of jihad is revived by Islamic leaders who try and rally Muslims against Westerners who have arrived in Syria and Palestine. I'm sometimes asked why military expansion is so important in the early history of Islam and not at all important in the early history of Christianity. And this question has been asked for a long time. During the Middle Ages, and even today, some Christians would contrast early Islam very unfavorably with early Christianity, doing so on moral grounds. They would point to passages in the Christian Bible where Jesus of Nazareth makes statements that are largely pacifist. If someone strikes you on the cheek, you must offer the other one. Those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. And they contrast these with the Quranic statements in which Muhammad speaks approvingly of warfare. And sometimes medieval scholars and even modern commentators will point out that, yes, Islam does spread as a result of military conquests into territories that it would not have reached as quickly otherwise, whereas Christians make no military conquests, at least in the first 3 centuries of Christianity's existence. Indeed, they are an illegal religion. Why this difference? Well, medieval authors would answer, and I sometimes see this in letters to the editor, that the reason is because Muhammad was a bad, violent person, but Jesus of Nazareth was a good person, and that explains the difference. Historians are uncomfortable with using bad and good as motives to explain anything. You might characterize someone's actions as bad or good, but rarely does someone do something simply because they're bad. Hitler does not exterminate Jews because he's bad. He's bad because he exterminates Jews. We would prefer to point to historical circumstances in explaining this undeniable difference in the early histories of Islam and Christianity. Islam acquired a territorial base almost immediately. Already during Muhammad's lifetime, Muhammad is in charge of Medina, and he is involved himself in warfare against Mecca. Christianity had no such territorial base for the first 3 centuries of its existence. There was no means for Christians to fight back against the Romans because they don't have a state and they don't have an army. Given the trajectory followed by early Islamic history and the fact that Muhammad was in charge of Medina and fighting himself against Mecca, it is not surprising that spiritually meritorious warfare becomes an important element of Islam from the beginning, whereas in Christianity, that's going to be a very long and slow development that is going to arise only in the post-Constantinian world. The expansion of the House of Islam is going to affect Europe directly and indirectly. Directly, Arabs, accompanied by Berbers from North Africa, conquer Visigothic Spain in the space of only about 5 years. And for centuries to come, most of Spain, or Al-Andalus as the Arabs call it, is going to be part of the House of Islam. In 711, an Arab governor in North Africa by the name of Musa sent one of his lieutenants, a freed slave named Tariq, to raid Visigothic Spain. And it was only supposed to be a raid, a cattle rustle essentially. But once Tariq had arrived in Spain, he encountered the Visigothic army and killed the Visigothic king in battle. And the Visigothic state began to collapse rather quickly as cities began to surrender to Tariq when he had not even attacked them yet. Musa realized that opportunity was knocking, and so he arrives in 712 with a larger army. And by 716, the Arabs and Berbers had captured most of the Iberian Peninsula. They had captured all the land up to a boundary formed by 2 rivers, the Duero and the Ebro River, leaving only the impoverished and mountainous north in the hands of Christian rulers. And in part, they didn't absorb the whole of Visigothic Spain because the north was too hard to conquer, the terrain favored the defenders, and because it wasn't worth having, certainly not when compared to what they had just captured, cities such as Toledo, for example. Following this conquest of most of Visigothic Spain, Arabs pushed even farther northward. For a brief period in the 720s, Arabs were in control of southwestern France in towns such as Toulouse, and the northward expansion of the Arabs is checked in 732 at the Battle of Poitiers, when someone named Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, a member of the Carolingian family, defeats a Muslim raiding party. For the Arabs, this is no big deal, but for the inhabitants of Francia, they regard this as deliverance from a seemingly inevitable takeover by the Arabs. The defeat of the Arabs at the Battle of Poitiers in 732 doesn't stop Arab expansion in Europe by any means. For example, the island of Sicily and southern Italy are captured by Arabs in the 9th century, and they are not pushed out from southern Italy, at least, until 915. But the victory at Poitiers did give the Christian inhabitants of Europe some confidence, at least, that they would be able to hold out against the Arabs and maintain their own independent existence. In conclusion, Islam emerged from Arabia, which on the frontiers of the Persian and Byzantine empires, with remarkable speed in the early 7th century. In the space of less than a century, Arabs had pushed westward all the way into Spain, which they had conquered by 716, and they even raided into Francia in the 720s and 730s. For Europe, the defeat of the Arabs at Poitiers in 732 was greeted with great relief, and Charles Martel and the Carolingian family, who were victorious at this battle, were going to parlay the prestige that they gained through it into an overthrow of the Merovingians and the creation of a new ruling dynasty, the Carolingian dynasty, that was going to dominate the politics of early medieval Europe. And in our next lecture, we're going to take a closer look at the early history of the Carolingians.